In the shadows of World War II, one of the most chilling and meticulously hidden atrocities unfolded in the forests of Katyn, a name that would become synonymous with betrayal and denial. The story begins in the early spring of 1940, when thousands of Polish officers, seen as a threat by the Soviet regime, were executed and buried in mass graves. The Soviets denied it for decades, but the truth couldn't stay hidden forever.
Welcome to the Unveiled History.
The Katyn Massacre was not an event that happened in the spur of the moment. It was a calculated act of political cleansing ordered from the very top of Soviet hierarchy. On March 5, 1940, a memorandum was sent from Lavrenti Beria, head of the Soviet secret police, to Joseph Stalin. It proposed the execution of 25,700 Polish nationalists and counter-revolutionaries, kept in Soviet prisoner of war camps and prisons in the occupied Polish territories. Stalin, along with other key figures of the Politburo, including Vyacheslav Molotov and Klement Voroshilov, approved this proposal. The victims were not only military officers, but also police officers, intellectuals, lawyers, doctors, and other Polish leaders who could pose a threat to Soviet control over Poland. On August 23, 1939, barely 9 days before the start of World War II, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union signed a non-aggression treaty in Moscow. It was also known as the German Pact or the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, which was coined from the surnames of the foreign ministers of both countries, which was also followed by a German-Soviet treaty of German-Soviet friendship cooperation and demarcation, and later by Stalin's request to join the Axis powers by 1940. The consequences of such a pact would be the systematic killing of 22,000 Polish individuals, composed of troops, elites, scholars, and ordinary citizens. As such, Poland was designated as a zone of influence which was to be distributed among the signatory, thus ensuring that Germans could invade the territory without the fear of direct confrontation from the Soviets. The Soviet Red Army did not condemn the Nazi invasion, but rather did the same, an event which ultimately led to the start of World War II. While the German troops invaded the western parts of Poland and began the massacre of Jews and Poles, the Red Army invaded the eastern part of Poland. They captured tens of thousands of Poles, both military and civilian, and sent them to prison camps throughout the Soviet territory. However, this punishment was not enough. A few months later, the head of the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, abbreviated NKVD, and forerunner of the KGB, Commissioner Lavrenti Beria, personally presented to Stalin a plan to exterminate Poles. This was quickly approved by the leader of the Soviet Union, so much so that on March 5, 1940, ordered that the death penalty be applied to Polish prisoners, calling them permanent and incorrigible enemies of Soviet power. Of course, the NKVD troops did not take long to comply with the orders. Of all the 22,000 prisoners killed, 8,000 were military prisoners of war, 6,000 were members of the Polish police, while the remaining were made up of members of the Polish intelligentsia, artists, historians, lawyers, scientists, engineers, writers and journalists, all of which were accused of being spies, saboteurs or revolutionaries against the Soviet regime. Coincidentally, of the 22,000 prisoners, 7,305 came from camps from what is now called Ukraine and Belarus, 6,311 from Oshtashtov, 3,820 from Starobelsk, and 4,420 from Kozielsk. 448 were granted amnesty and thus survived the massacre. Between April and May of 1940, these men were systematically transported from several camps, including Kozelsk, Starobelsk, and Oshkotov, to execution sites. The primary site, Katyn Forest near Smolensk, was chosen due to its isolation and the ease with which mass graves could be concealed. At Katyn, the prisoners were led into the forest, one by one, under the pretense of being moved to new locations or for medical checks. Instead, they were executed with a shot to the back of the head, and their bodies then thrown into mass graves. The scale of the operation was immense. The mass graves at Katyn alone were estimated to contain 4,421 bodies. this was just one of several sites. The meticulous nature of the killings included the removal of any military insignia and personal items that could identify the victims, aiming to erase their identities forever. However, not all could be hidden. Some prisoners managed to hide personal items or carve messages on trees or in the bark, leaving silent testaments to their fate. The world did not learn of these atrocities until after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. But in 1943, when German forces discovered the mass graves, they publicised the findings, including exhumations and forensic work, to discredit the Soviets. The Nazis, however, were no saints in this narrative, having committed their own atrocities, where their discovery of Katyn brought the massacre to international attention. The Soviet response was swift and total denial. They accused the Germans of the massacre, a claim they maintained throughout the war and into the Cold War era. In 1944, the Soviet Union set up a commission led by Nikolai Budenko that falsely concluded that Germans were responsible for the Katyn killings. This narrative was supported by their allies, including the US and Britain, who chose political expediency over truth during the war. After World War II, Katyn became a taboo subject in Eastern Europe, especially within the Soviet Union and its satellite states. Any mention or investigation into Katyn was suppressed, with historians and anyone questioning the official Soviet narrative facing persecution. The truth was slowly pieced together through the efforts of survivors, families of the victims, and the brave few journalists and historians. The first significant crack in Soviet denial came in 1989, amidst the crumbling of the Soviet Union, when the USSR admitted that the KGB had been responsible for the massacre under Stalin's orders. However, the full scope and acknowledgement came after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. In 1990, Mikhail Gorbachev acknowledged the Soviet responsibility for the Katyn massacre, releasing related documents. This was followed by further declassifications under Boris Yeltsin, who in 1992 handed over a trove of documents to Polish President Lech Walesa, including the infamous Beria's Note. In Poland, Katyn became more than just a historical event. It was a symbol of Soviet oppression and a national tragedy. Memorials were erected, and the massacre was taught in schools as a lesson of history and remembrance. The international community's full recognition came in 2010 when the European Parliament passed a resolution calling Katyn a crime against humanity, emphasising the need for continued remembrance and education about such events to prevent future atrocities. The revelation of the Katyn massacre had profound effects on international relations, particularly between Poland and Russia. The acknowledgement of Soviet guilt in the 1990s led to a complex relationship where Poland sought acknowledgement, apologies, and reparations, while Russia, under different leadership, oscillated between acceptance and backtracking on the historical narrative. For the families of the victims, the acknowledgement was bittersweet. They had spent decades fighting for recognition, often at great personal risk. The unveiling of the truth was a vindication of their long-standing claims, but also reopened wounds that had never truly healed. Memorials were established, including the Katyn Museum in Warsaw, which not only serves as a place of remembrance, but also educates about the broader context of Soviet persecution in Eastern Europe. The Katyn massacre influenced Polish culture deeply, manifesting in literature, film, and art. Jerzy Andrzejewski's novel Ashes and Diamonds and Andrzej Wajda's film Katyn brought the narrative to a broader audience, embedding the event in the collective memory of Poles as a symbol of national martyrdom and resistance against oppression. Politically, Katyn became a touchstone in discussions about historical memory, justice, and the nature of totalitarian regimes. It understood the debate on how society should deal with past atrocities committed by previous governments, particularly when those governments were once allies. The memory of Katyn has been used to discuss broader issues like the ethics of war, the rights of prisoners, and the responsibilities of nations in acknowledging and atoning for historical crimes. It has sparked academic research into Soviet-era repressions, leading to a more nuanced understanding of how totalitarian regimes operate and the long-term effects on societies they control. Today, Katyn is a reminder in international diplomacy that human rights discourse of the dangers of historical revision. With rising nationalism and the manipulation of historical facts for political gain in various parts of the world, Katyn serves as a cautionary tale. It teaches that truth, once buried, can be unearthed, and that justice, though delayed, holds enduring significance. Moreover, the massacre's legacy informs current discussions on how to handle mass atrocities, from genocide recognition to the establishment of truth commissions in post-conflict societies. It has influenced international law, particularly in how crimes against humanity are defined and prosecuted. The Katyn Massacre, an act shrouded in secrecy and denial for decades, stands as a testament to human cruelty and resilience. It teaches us about the importance of historical truth, the dangers of political manipulation, and the unyielding quest for justice by those who remember and those who refuse to let history be silenced. As we look back on this event, we are reminded that while the truth can be buried, it can never be truly hidden forever. Through remembrance, education, and acknowledgement, we honour the victims and ensure that such dark chapters of history are not forgotten but learned from, guiding us towards a future where such atrocities are not repeated.